So I think Frank's going to be mostly moderating, but has spotty internet, so I will hop in if anything becomes a problem.
Yeah, if I get dropped off, just Lisa's running the show.
It's a plan.
Should we start?
Yeah, let's do this.
Let's do it.
Cool. So I'm Frank Errickson. I graduated last year with my PhD, advised by David Anthoff, and now I'm a postdoc at the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment at Princeton. That's kind of my quick spiel. David, do you want to give yourself a quick introduction?
Sure. Yeah, I'm David. I joined ERG in 2014 and have been there ever since. Feel very much that I found my home with ERG, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
And Lisa, do you want to introduce yourself real quick, just in case you become the host?
Yeah, for sure. Hi, I'm Lisa Reynolds. I am a second-year PhD student at ERG. I'm also advised by David and have worked with Frank a bit as well. And I'm also getting a master's in the CS department, so pretty heavily focused on the computer science programming side of things. So I felt incredibly lucky to find perhaps the only advisor who is nerdy enough to love computer science with me, but also is a climate economist. So excited to hear how David got to be where he is, because it's a winding path.
Okay, so that's a perfect segue. So I think the description for this session kind of just listed every topic that David and I have even talked about in the last 6 years. And so we were hoping to do something a little bit more focused, thinking about kind of how David came into this field and what the current climate policy framework looks like in the United States, in particular, the social cost of carbon, and ways we can improve them, in particular, thinking about how to incorporate equity and things like that in these estimates. But so Lisa's comment on the nerdy advisor thing is a perfect segue to start. So David, I wanted to ask you first, your current work involves a lot of computer programming, but I remember at one of our lab lunches, you mentioned that as a kid, you would be the type that would just build a computer from scratch. So can you discuss kind of where that inspiration came from and where you just were the type of kid that would just build a computer from scratch? Was it a family member or just random?
That's a good question. No, I can certainly say it was not a family member. My mom had a talent for math, but was not into computers at all. My dad, I think, checked out when it came to square roots. So that is certainly not where that interest came from. I started being interested in computers very early on. I remember I started renting books from the local library about programming before we even had a computer. I just read the books, I mean, if you want to talk about something dry. So I don't know. I was just always fascinated by software, and I did try to build a computer at some point. I think it was in 8th grade. Spent a lot of time putting chips on little plates and trying to get it to work. It never actually worked. It was one of the big failures of my life. It showed something on the screen, but not what I wanted. But I can actually not pinpoint, what the trigger was. I think there was certainly not a person that sort of inspired me or brought me towards that question.
Okay, and so I was looking at your CV before this chat, and it said from 1994 to 2003, you were a software developer in Germany, and you founded your own tech startup. And then it also says in 2003, you got a degree in philosophy and formal logic. And so I think ergies don't take a very linear path, but that was quite an abrupt change. So can you talk about the transition from 10 years of software development to philosophy and formal logic?
Yeah. I mean, the software, so I was always interested in sort of software development. And then towards sort of the end of my high school years, I worked for a software developer. There are some really hilarious stories about that I don't want to go into today. And then at sort of towards the end of my high school years, I started a startup with 2 friends in the software field. So that was sort of my primary thing. So that was first in parallel to high school, and then it was in parallel to my university when I started university. And so that was sort of one part of my life. And then the other part was I finished high school and I wanted to study. And I studied philosophy, formal logic, and I think theory of science was the third part of that. I picked that because I wanted to learn how to think and get sort of clarity into my, just sort of how do you think about things and how do you shape an argument. And it was fantastic for that. But it sort of, so the sort of my software life and my academic life at that point for a while ran in parallel. And then at some point, it also just became clear that you cannot do both. So I think that was actually the time in my life where I really worked the hardest. And at some point, there was a point where I just needed to make a decision. Do I want to continue with academia or do I want to do this software thing? And luckily enough, I decided for academia. So yeah.
Okay, and so the next detour, you did an interdisciplinary degree at Oxford, which I think is kind of like the ERG degree.
Yeah.
And then you did a PhD in economics at the Max Planck Research School on Earth System Modeling. And so Lisa and I were chatting about this a bit, but can you describe how you do this quick transition now from philosopher to climate economist?
Yeah, so I always knew that the philosophy thing was my undergraduate degree and that I would stop after that. So I never had any plans to become a full-time philosopher or anything like that. I wanted to I knew I wanted to pick up certain skills and then, but I never had a plan to do a PhD in philosophy, for example. I think the common theme was that I had always been interested in environmental problems. So the master in environmental change that I did, that I think was a pretty natural progression from my interests that I had. I mean, they didn't sort of manifest themselves in my first degree, but I kind of knew that I wanted to do something in that space. So that was, I think it's sort of certainly for the people that knew me, my friends and so on, were not surprised when I took that path. But I hadn't really interacted with economics much at all. So I think during that master, which is very similar to the ERG master, I had an economics faculty, Cameron Hepburn, and he was incredibly inspiring. So I think that was probably, I blame him that I decided that I switched gear and I started doing a lot of economics during my master, and then the decision to get a PhD in economics certainly sort of originated out of the mentorship that I got from Cam. Yeah.
And so during your PhD, this is when you first started kind of working with the modeling side of things, working with integrated assessment models, and your PhD advisor was one of the developers of the fund model, which is kind of one of the main models the world uses to estimate the social cost of carbon. And so so everybody's on the same page, can you briefly describe the social cost of carbon? What is it? How do we estimate it?
Yeah.
How does the government?
I actually started working on that during my master. So that's actually so my master project was bringing equity into the social cost of carbon. So the social cost of carbon is a metric of the harm done by emitting 1 extra ton of CO2 into the atmosphere. You can also phrase it the other way around. So if you reduce emissions by 1 ton, it's the benefit that we get. The idea is that it is a measure of so if we put up an extra ton into the atmosphere, as I'm sure all ergies know, it will stay in the atmosphere forever and it will essentially affect everyone on the planet, right? Because it will increase temperatures, and because climate change is a global public good, it affects everyone. And so that's sort of the idea of the social cost of carbon, that we try to measure the impact, the harm that's caused by by climate change. And I got into this in my master because in the United Kingdom at that point, so this was in 2003, 2004, they had actually been using a social cost of carbon for cost benefit analysis at the federal, it's not a federal system, but at sort of at the UK government level. And so that was sort of a hot topic in the UK back then. And that's how I started with this, working on the social cost of carbon. And it's been with me ever since.
So I was actually going to ask about incorporating equity into the social cost of carbon. I didn't realize you had done that in your master's degree. I thought that came later on with Richard. But so can you briefly describe how you incorporate equity into the social cost of carbon? And was this influenced by your philosophy work, or are those still totally separate?
Yeah. So I mean, maybe I'll start with the second part. It was not influenced by my philosophy work at all. So the type of work that I had done in philosophy, I think I took one course in ethics at some point in my philosophy studies, but my work in philosophy was on a very different topic. It was, yeah, I don't even.
I was hoping for this nice storyline where you did philosophy and it led into the social.
No, there's no nice storyline at all. And the work I did in philosophy was much more theoretical and sort of divorced from anything that's happening in the real world than even what you might do in an ethics course. But sort of on the substantive question here. So in a standard cost benefit analysis in econ, you do not care about distributional aspects, right? So that's sort of the standard model that someone from the University of Chicago would advocate. You count all the benefits, you count all the costs, but you do not care where the benefits land and where the costs land. You just net them up, and then you say, all right, if we have net positive benefits, we could, in theory, compensate the losers, and so therefore we think this is a good policy. And that is weird in almost any case, but it is especially weird in a climate context, because there are no compensation payments happening between what's happening here in the United States and what's happening in somewhere in Africa or something like that. That whole framework is just not there. And the other more core problem really is that the people that are affected by climate change are in such different socioeconomic situations that just comparing and counting up dollars gives you a very skewed idea of the harm that you're doing. So just as an example, if I lose $1, I might be a little bit annoyed, but it's not having in any way a significant impact on my life, right? If I experience a loss of $1. If someone who lives on $1 a day loses $1, that has a real significant impact on their livelihood and their well-being. And so what we did back then is that we incorporated that sort of intuition that $1 has a different worth to someone who has a lot of dollars already than to someone who doesn't, into the computation of the social cost of carbon. And I should say, I think this is sort of where non-economists sometimes get hung up. When we say dollars, we actually mean just stuff. So it's just if you're someone who has a life where you consume a lot, and it doesn't have to be in dollar terms, it's just you have a car, you have great healthcare, you have education, then for you losing, a certain object is less bad than for someone who barely survives. So it's probably not the right thing to think about. The monetary aspect is not the important one. It's really the question of what your circumstances are.
So around this time, I don't know if it was during your PhD or afterwards, but you were part of the group that was estimating the social cost of carbon for the US government. Was that during or after?
So this was sort of towards the end of my PhD, I think. Yes, it's sort of all a while ago.
So towards the end of your PhD, so these equity weighted estimates are still around, and the government is instituting a social cost of carbon to use in US cost benefit analysis. So could you just describe what that process was like a bit? And in particular, was there talk of using the equity weighted values, or was there pushback against that, or was there ever like an effort?
Yeah, so it's actually, okay, so the history of that is quite interesting, because in the United Kingdom, when they had used the social cost of carbon, they had incorporated these equity ideas into their official governmental number. They had done it wrong. So they just gotten the math wrong. And so, I mean, I don't think this is sort of super widely known, but essentially what they did was complete nonsense. Just it was just wrong. But conceptually, the idea was there. and when then in the United States, so this was sort of towards the end of the second Bush administration, and then the beginning of the Obama administration, when the idea of, hey, maybe there will be a social cost of carbon at the federal level that will be used in regulatory impact analysis, when that sort of was active in the United States, the equity idea did not fly. That did not get a lot of attention, much discussion. I think there was a general sort of feeling of the people that were involved around, like, it would be a miracle if we can get any number into this process. If we try to add equity into this and essentially step outside of the traditional framework that is used in cost-benefit analysis in the United States, we would just doom chances to get this established in the federal process at all. So I think that was sort of what a lot of people back then felt. And I should also say, this equity idea that we had developed sort of in the early 2000s, there was always a sizable group of economists that really liked it. And these were sort of established, mainstream economists, but it was never a majority, right? So I don't have a number, but I would always, I would push this and talk about it. And when I go to a sort of normal econ conference, I would always find a sizable group of people that were really perceptive to that. But if I had polled the room, I don't think I would have ever gotten over 50%, right? So that, I think, was sort of the vibe in the situation back when the first iteration of the social cost of carbon in the US was developed.
So you recently had a paper or a comment in Nature with 8 recommendations for the Biden administration for their social cost of carbon estimates, and one of them was incorporating equity weights. So do you think it's kind of a politically feasible thing now, or is it still kind of this tension with economists not liking it?
So I have to say, I've been incredibly surprised what happened over the last 6 to 12 months or something like that in this space, because I've been trying to push this or talking about this equity stuff since 2003, and for 15 years or something like that, I had this ceiling of people, right? I mean, I've always had an audience. I always had people that supported this, but I kind of lost hope that this might be picked up in a broader sense, at least in the United States. It's a very different situation in other countries. But the last 6 to 12 months have really, I did not predict that. I did not see this coming, but I think there's really a realistic window that this might be adopted and picked up at the federal level in the United States. And there's just a lot of people that have come out in favor now for this concept that I did not expect to come out in favor of that concept. So Michael Greenstone, the Milton Friedman professor of economics at the University of Chicago, testified yesterday in front of Congress suggesting that equity weighting should be used for this. Like, what's happening here? I mean, I know that Michael has been in favor of that kind of idea for a long time, but the Chicago School of Economics is certainly not the place that I would have expected any support for this. And there are a couple of other, there are a lot of sort of people involved in this that are actually starting to advocate for that. So I think there's this theory of policy windows that you have an idea and then you keep talking about it for a long, long time. And if you're lucky, at some point, randomly, a window opens up where this idea might actually fly. I think Granger Morgan, I've heard Granger Morgan sort of talk about this idea. And sort of this was many years ago, he was like, stick with this idea, keep talking about it, keep it in the back of the minds of people. And maybe if you're lucky at some point, a window will open. And I kind of feel that we might actually have that right now. Now, if you forced me to bet whether it will be adopted, I'm not sure I would actually put all my money on it, but I'm much more optimistic than I've ever been.
But you're doing some work on this stuff. You're doing background work on equity weighting to make sure it's there if they do go to instigate it?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, you and I have been working
Yeah.
on this. I'm working with a lot of other people. I think the good thing about this is that we are actually in a space and in a position where if the political will was there to pick this up, it is ready to be picked up. I don't, so this is sort of, I mean, if you want to change how something is done at the federal level, and you don't have and there's no record of publications around this, and people are not familiar with these ideas, it's difficult to sort of push something like that through like overnight, right? Mm-hmm. At least I think in the executive regulatory branch, I think the story is quite different in maybe other with laws but I think there's a hesitation in the executive branch to sort of jump onto something that hasn't been tested by the academic community for a while. But I think with this, it has been around for a long time, right? And I think people are familiar with it. And I think it could be used tomorrow, quite frankly, if the will was there. I don't think there's a need for more research or something like that. I think it's ready to be picked up.
So I think we have around 10 minutes left. So do you want to just quickly mention some recent work you're doing to improve the SEC that the Biden administration might pick up? And if you want to plug Mimi or something like that, you can.
Yeah,
and then we can move on to any questions. I see there's one in the chat. If people have come up with any others, feel free to type them or just say you have a question and we'll go through those.
Yeah, so one thing that we've been, and I mean, both Frank and Lisa have been sort of really crucial parts of that. So one thing that we've been working on in my lab over the last many years now is what's a good, I mean, so the situation at the federal level was that when they picked the social cost of carbon for their regulatory analysis, they essentially picked 3 models that existed at that point, and then they averaged them. So that was sort of the process. And that gave the people that created these models a lot of influence over that process, right? So essentially, the people that had created these models were almost like the gatekeepers for all the information from climate science, impact research, I mean, like almost everything into the regulatory process. And now the number of people that were involved in building these models originally was very small. So it was 2 of the models were built by individuals, and then the model that I was involved with, we were 2 people, right? So all 4 men that sort of had built this. And if you think about how much influence these models had, that's sort of like a horrible way to do public policy, right? To have this very small group of people to sit on these models and sort of control things. I mean, it was sort of fantastic for me personally, but from a public policy point of view, that's not a good way to run things. So what we've been working on for a long time is a way to break these models up into their individual parts, make it much easier to have much larger teams work on these models, so that you have a climate scientist working on the climate science, a methane expert working on the methane stuff, and sort of bring in larger groups, make it much easier for new researchers that want to sort of focus on one part to just work on that part, so that you don't have to sort of dedicate your career to climate economics. Maybe you're a specialist on sea level rise, right? And you want to improve the parts in these models around sea level rise. And so we've built a computer platform essentially over the last couple of years that enables that kind of work. And it's called Mimi. And it's I know that the people at EPA are using and playing with it every day now. And so I hope that makes it easier. And so my goal with that is really or my hope is that more people will be able to contribute to this research, that it will get a broader set of inputs, and not just sort of a very small group of people that decide to dedicate their entire career to only this one question.
Great. Lisa, do you want to go to some Q&A?
Sure. It looks like we can start with Zach, who has a question, and then in his words, spicier question. Zach, I'll let you decide which question you want to ask first. If that article has not been read, then probably would be hard to answer, but the other one.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of roll them up into one. Yeah, I mean, like the article, I think, touched on some of these same questions. Like certainly I was aware of some of these questions like as a ERG grad student. So I'm glad that like people are paying attention to it now. I'll let you choose.
Well, David, did you read the article by the No Opinion guy
No.
criticizing climate economics?
Noah Smith.
No.
No
Yeah, Noah
opinion is
Smith.
his.
Yeah.
No opinion is his handle.
No, I did not.
Okay.
Okay, so Zach,
Okay.
you could give your other question then if you want.
Really quick, my spicy answer to that is I think you should have written it 20 years ago.
Nice spicy answer. This is great.
Maybe give David the high level takeaway and see if he has a response maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's, like, I think it covers a lot of ground that we're probably familiar with, like the prevalence of Nordhaus, with like too high discount rates, not counting equity, not counting risk, too much of a focus on carbon pricing when, for years there's, kind of increasing evidence that that's not like all of climate policy. It was just sort of a rundown, I think, of it wasn't saying that like no one's doing better things, but that like the kind of mainstream economics conversation that a lot of folks outside the field are paying attention to has not really absorbed those lessons.
Okay, yeah. So let's see. I mean, I almost had Bill Nordhaus once write a paper with equity weighting in his. So there's a working paper where he used the method that I had developed in my master thesis. And I still remember when I read this, I was so proud. I got Bill to move on this. And then I think somewhere between publishing the working paper and sending it to a journal, he decided that he actually did not want to go that direction with these equity aspects. So it never came out as a proper paper. I mean, a lot of people like to bash on Nordhaus. I have to admit, I admire him. I've met him many times. He's one of the most thoughtful persons that I've ever met. So it's sort of just my personal experience with him. Before I met him, I had sort of a picture in my mind of someone who's very narrow-minded, and after I had met him, I really have exactly the opposite impression about him. So you're not going to hear Nordhaus bashing from me. I think, I mean, there are many issues with these models that they don't handle well. So we just need to be really clear about that, because it's a incredibly difficult question that we're trying to answer, right? So it's sort of almost, it's just difficult to think about these, to think that we might get a precise, narrow answer for such a big question. So I think there is, I think when this comes to sort of how should these models be used in policy, there's a question that really comes up, right? Because in an academic journal, you can say, hey, I'm answering narrowly this particular question, but I'm not going to, and I'm ignoring these aspects. But when it comes to making policy, you can't really do that, right? And so in my mind, the best use of these models in policy is to bring transparency into the process, bring information in it. I get very nervous once they get used in sort of automatic target setting or something like that. So I wouldn't want, the United Nations to take my model, run it, and say, X is the temperature target that we should shoot for, because there are aspects that are important for that decision that are not reflected in my model or in any of the other models. But I do think it is helpful in the regulatory process, in a cost-benefit analysis, where the agency is free to, they just need to report the costs and benefits. They can pass a policy that does not have net positive benefits if they want, right? That sort of, there's no automatic mechanism that, the technocratic work that we do directly influences or constrains what they are allowed to do. But I think sort of adding that as an additional piece of information and forcing the agency to go through the exercise of computing all these things is helpful. And I'm various windows are popping up.
We have
warning me
50
about
seconds
time.
left. Do you wanna just close with some brilliant quip?
No.
Uh,
I enjoyed the discussion, but you won't get a brilliant quip from me.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate Frank and David, both of you preparing and joining us for this. This was fun. And hopefully if people have questions or want to reach out to either of them in the future, go for it, or in the happy hour at the end if they're sticking around. Yeah, see you guys all in the main room.
All right, thank you.